Is Fazal Muradi, and I'm a visiting scholar at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. And for this Actuvirtual Symposium, we have come together to discuss a book that is edited by Kai Kresse and Oriara Nyarawat, with the title Rethinking Sage Philosophy, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on and Beyond Age Odera Orokwa. Sorry? We are going to start off with Kai. We are to take about 15 minutes to introduce the book to those of us who are here in person and those who are online with us. And after their introduction into the book, we will turn to three of the contributors to the book. And this means we are going to start in the following order. We start with Benedetta Lanfranucci, who is a postdoc at the University of Bayreuth. Reginald Odor is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Nairobi. And Bruce Johns, who is professor in the Department of Philosophy and co-director for the Center of Humanities and Digital Research and core faculty of the Text and Technology PhD program, all at the University of Central Florida. Kai Kresse is professor of social and cultural anthropology at the Free University of Berlin and vice director of the Leibniz Center for Modern Orient. Oriara Nyarawat is a senior lecturer of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. So, Kai, we start up with you. Take 15 minutes, and if you take 1-2 minutes extra, that will be fine.
Yeah, well, Fazil and your team, thank you so much for inviting us to present this book, which came out at the beginning of the year. So Oriana and myself will now take turns. Together we have these around 15 minutes to introduce this book, Rethinking Sage Philosophy, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on and Beyond Henry Odera Oruka. And yeah, for us, the title is a bit evocative of trying to do several things of thinking with Oruka's Sage Philosophy project, having sort of a critical review of it, commenting from different perspectives on it, both in terms of regional perspectives as well as disciplinary ones. I also want to welcome or make us aware that we have two further authors present who I hope will engage or come in later in discussion, Donna Pido and Odoch Pido. But let me start by just introducing those of you who don't know much about Henry Odera Oruka into our picture. As I show here on our first slide, he as an academic who had his early education in Kenya and then went to study philosophy abroad, first in Uppsala in Sweden and then Wayne State University in Michigan in the US. He turned in the early 1970s to University of Nairobi, where he was active as a tutorial fellow, but was very active also as a teacher and fought for the independence of the philosophy department from religious studies. That was initially combined and was the first head of department back then. He also founded the journal Thought and Practice, which had been revived as an online journal in 2011. It is still ongoing. And tragically, he passed away in December 1995. As a victim of a road accident. And he was a public intellectual who was regularly contributing also to Kenyan newspapers. Now, this is not going forward. I don't know why. My PowerPoint is not working. Should I jump back and forth? Should I go out and go in again? Maybe I'll do it very elegantly. I'll pass over to Oriare to chip in from his side, and then I'll join again with the second part of my PowerPoint. when we tried it before it worked, so I'll be back. Thanks. Oriade, over to you.
Okay, all of you are welcome. Actually, as has been introduced, I'm from the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and I studied, many people may not know, I studied under Oruka. Oruka was my teacher of philosophy at both undergraduate and postgraduate studies. I did my master's under his supervision and wrote my PhD on his philosophy. For those who have read such philosophy, well, this is just to remind ourselves, and for those who have not read the background, it is important to look at this book and such philosophy's project from its historical perspective. The project, Oruka began the project in 1974. But at that time, there was a movement continental-wide about decolonization of the thought, the knowledge, the disciplines, the universities, the countries that were just independent. And of course, Oruka's such philosophy is part of this movement that was decolonizing the knowledge in Africa and the colonial systems. And it was not just in philosophy, there was also a strong movement in history, literature, to introduce well, there's a bit of noise. I don't know whether to wait or just continue. Yes, it is working.
So I leave it like this for you to just to. Oh. You continue, Oriade, and but I can take over whenever you want.
Okay, I'll just give my background, and then maybe I'll hand over to you to continue. So such philosophy emerges from these process attempts to decolonize the disciplines, decolonize the curriculum, our universities, our education system, which were not only in Kenya but all over Africa, and therefore there was a very strong colonial position that had already questioned and doubted the possibilities of African generating knowledge, including philosophy. And such philosophy emerges at a time when there was already two very strong schools coming up. That is the ethnophilosophy attempting to justify the existence of African philosophy, but somehow not satisfactorily, very contestably. And of course, people like Oruka, who had just been trained in philosophy, mostly in the Western part of the system of education, were also being doubted as really representing African philosophy. So Oruka was still determined because the colonial racist position was very strong, as maybe you can read if you have read the preface by Masolo. Even within the department where Oruka worked, his philosophical capacity was questioned. So Oruka was determined to prove that philosophy is a universal human activity. It is not a racial activity. But for him to satisfactorily do that, he had to introduce such philosophy, which was emerging from what was then perceived as purely African background, and therefore could not be easily contested. So that's the background. So sage philosophy emerges as part of the colonial discourse, the colonization discourse in African philosophy. And therefore, reading this book, one needs that background as to the historical background and context of the emergence of sage philosophy. Okay, maybe I can just hand it over back to you. Kai, are you muted?
Yeah.
Sorry, now we're here. Yeah, right? So I wanted to just also convey a little bit of a sense of projects that Oruka was engaged in that were apart from, different to the Sage Philosophy projects, and you can see some of the titles here. We could engage more with them. Just to point to the 1994 one, which was actually an edited volume of the World Congress of Philosophy, which he had organized in Nairobi in 1991, with the particular focus on ecology and humanity, as you see. So very much before his time, or very kind. So, and we can move on, I was hoping. Yes. Also to point out that there is a growing body now on secondary literature on Oruka that you may or may not be aware of. And actually the most recent and perhaps most recommendable title is Gail Presby's new book on the life and thought of Henry Odera Oruka, which just came out this year with Bloomsbury in the World Philosophy series there. The Sage Philosophy project itself was published by Oruka in 2 books and a whole series of articles. These are the 2 book covers of the books. The Sage Philosophy book itself, which contained excerpts of interviews with sages, whom he divided into philosophical ones and folk sages, and a whole length book on Oginga Odinga, who was one of the most important post-independent politicians of Kenya, whom Oruka knew very well. And this is a significant shift in the sense that he here zoomed in with a complete book on one individual thinker. And that was also in a way the prospect, the vision that he had for further work, which he unfortunately wasn't able to do and complete and to publish on because of his early demise. This is just to give us a sense of the idea of sage philosophy as a third way, as it was called by him, Oruka himself, and also Kwasi Veredu, where he came in with this project to, in a way, mediate a stalemate discussion between the ethno-philosophical camp and those whom Oruka himself called the professional philosophy camp. I guess most people will have a hunch of the situation. Is just to flag up here that Oruka saw this as a third way, the approach to interview individual thinkers within Kenyan communities, or by extension other African communities, to document their reflexive thought, and thus sort of show how there are, or maybe philosophical traditions of philosophical thought, that philosophers should be documenting, African philosophers should be documenting in their respective communities and countries. So the Sage Philosophy project went along with an appeal for philosophers to conduct fieldwork, to do these kind of interviews, in order not only to prove these racial and racist prejudices wrong, but also to constructively and productively provide texts to engage with, discourses to interpret and to engage with as scholars. And so just also to point to the scope of whom Oruka understood as sages. On the one hand, there was a strong impetus to link this idea of a sage as those who are rooted in the cultural milieu of their traditional Africa, because the point, after all, was to prove that those who are not educated within modern Western education, and thus, the sages of Africa have have opportunity to show their philosophical thinking, or they can be shown to have that. So the emphasis on the traditional, but on the other hand, he was aware that this was not all. So he the second quote shows that there are, Gandhi, Lenin, Nyerere as sort of public modern figures who are also by him seen as sages. So we should keep that in mind. And this is just to point you to the background that we had several workshops and collaborative engagements when I was based in New York at Columbia University, but also a couple of conference workshops in Nairobi in 2017 and 2018 that were the basis for this book. And this is our table of contents. So let me close and hand over to Oriana briefly again, just with the following remarks. I think what we would like to see, or what we feel that this book provides us and the readers with, is basically a little bit of a textbook in the sense that we have quite different takes here by different kinds of scholars who themselves are pursuing different sort of projects of their own from different discipline, with a sometimes explicit interdisciplinary emphasis. Including sort of a decolonial take by Jared Sachs, an anthropological take by Donna Pido, but also I think the textbook qualities of sorts, or the aspects of using this as a study book, are also that we have quite a few appendices here, particularly two interviews with female sages that Gail Presby led in the late 1990s, and reprints of earlier interviews that I conducted with Oruka himself. And yeah, maybe let me close with these observations. Oriana pointed already to the foreword by Masolo, and we were also very lucky to have an afterword by Anke Granes. So these are the brackets also who hold the other chapters together. Yeah, Oriana, maybe over to you for some last editorial remarks before we hand over to the contributors. Thank you.
Well, I think that our time may be over, but since quite a number of contributors are present and they will expound on their chapters, maybe I just need to mention that as a recap, chapter 2 of that book, Exploring Indigenous Knowledge, Kai has captured it very well, because such philosophy was not just a response to the doubting colonial mentality of the African capability of philosophy, but it also became a way of documenting indigenous knowledges, and Walker captures that very well in chapter 2, as well as comparing the emergence of such philosophy and a parallel movement again in Kenya in oral literature. Then maybe I need to mention something about chapter 4 and the one on Gail. Well, Gail's contribution brings in a dimension which has not been very well brought out in such philosophy project, especially the contribution of women sages. And because it looks like that is part of, well, the separation or the non-recognition of women sages may be historical and cultural, in the sense that the way women express their philosophy may not be obvious to many people in certain practical senses. And Gail brings in that practical dimension, how women are sages, but more so in their practical way of life. Since I don't know whether Peter is not going to present, but he's around. Both Donna and Odoch have another dimension, which well, Donna also brings in the aspect of women sages, but more so in the material culture and especially in art. which is apparently is not very easily recognized, how art, certain forms of art and systems may have philosophical imports. So that is another unique dimension that Donna brings in as she explains the women Maasai art as a system that bring in this other dimension of philosophy, which has not been extensively or adequately explored in African philosophy. Odoch also brings in rather very subtle dimension of such philosophy, but more so how individual thought is in interface with the collective dimension of thought, particularly as he presents the actually concept of being human. Well, it can be a bit controversial, but that is the controversy that lies between the individual thought and the collective thought. So it also brings in that dimension, which is also very interesting to read. And of course, we had to go through and make these, all these, which may look controversial, but to see how people can rethink and think with such philosophy, and then how variously it is interpreted in different aspects. Then Jared Sachs also brings in almost the same line as Donna and Odoch. Again, how the interface between the individual thinker and the collective thinker, and how individuals are a product of social discourses, and how it can be problematic to demarcate the individual thought from the social thinking. I think I want to stop there because our time is far much over. We have eaten into that other time. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening and for this opportunity.
Thank you. So
after the contributors' presentation, they will take each 10 to 12 minutes. Then we can come back to the two of you to give a short response before we open up to a discussion with everyone who are present. So Benedetta, if you can hear me, we can just start with you.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you to the Johannesburg Institute for inviting us. It's great to be here. I actually also have a PowerPoint for my chapter. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So just to jump in quickly with what Kai and Oriade had already mentioned, this was a project that evolved kind of over 2 years of these wonderful workshops we had in Nairobi in 2017 and 2018, which Kai mentioned, which was really a special occasion. We were scholars from all over the world. I think one of the most interesting aspects of this was we actually did field work together. So it was a blend of like academic conferencing and then actually going out with buses and doing some of our own, sage philosophy interviews in the style of Aruka. And we were hosted by the University of Nairobi and all our colleagues there. And it was just such a special time. And I think partly this is why I love this book so much, because there's also this memory of this kind of collective work together, which it's unique in my experience as a scholar. I kind of never worked in this really group atmosphere as we did. And yes, I love picking up the book and remembering those days. So my contribution in this book connects the thought of Henry Odera Aruka and an Italian thinker, activist, politician even, intellectual, which is Antonio Gramsci, which many of you might be familiar with. He was incarcerated in 1928 under Italy's fascist regime, and he died in prison. Now, the comparative reading is completely my own, in the sense that Aruka doesn't give any hint at any point of having been familiar or even attracted to the thought of Gramsci, right? So this is my own kind of comparative exercise. it's been a way also for me to reread my own history and my own philosophical tradition through African philosophy, which has been wonderful. And this is also the direction I'm taking in my work now, to do that more and more, to kind of look at Italian intellectual thought comparatively with some cases of African intellectual thought and political history. Now, and even though Oruka doesn't mention Gramsci ever in his work, an African philosopher who does very explicitly is Pauline Huntonji, right? Who we know, of course, was very influential on Oruka. And Huntonji was a very, I would say, profound reader of Gramsci. I think he's understood him much better than a lot of his European critics. And Huntonji understood how the Gramscian categories were also profoundly implicated in the project of creating African philosophy as an academic area of expertise, and what the risks of that enterprise was, especially ethnophilosophy, which we know was the big debate at the time, in which Oruka also took part very actively and very importantly. Now, why did I bring these two thinkers together in this chapter for this book? Well, they have a strikingly similar idea about what philosophy is. And this idea is mainly the division of philosophy into what they call two orders or two levels. So a first order philosophy, which is an order that every reasonable person is conversant with, in the words of Oruka, or that is proper to everyone, in the words of Gramsci. And there's a second order philosophy, which is the critical evaluation of that first order. And they both use this word critical evaluation constantly, right? So this idea that, the second order requires also a sort of distance from the first order. Now, this idea is not new to philosophy. I mean, Kai Kresse, for example, in his introduction to philosophizing in Mombasa, where he's setting out his method of the anthropology of philosophy, he takes us back to Kant's conception of philosophy divided in kind of the worldly and the scholarly, which is exactly these two orders that also Oruka and Gramsci are bringing us. But I would say they are two thinkers in the kind of contemporary philosophical scene who are really systematic about this, and who really, their whole idea of philosophy is centered around this division in a kind of very important way. Now, of course, with the exception that Oruka adds a third order, which is not there in Gramsci, which is precisely his sage philosophy. Right? So he tells us that between the folk philosophy and the written critical discourse, sage philosophy comes as the third alternative. It demonstrates the fact that traditional Africa had both folk wisdom and critical personalized philosophy. So, and this third way is key for Oruka, because without it, African philosophy was being trapped between either ethnophilosophy on one side or academic philosophy on the other side, both of which were kind of Western creations. Right, so he's setting out a space for African philosophy on its own terms and not defined by the Western canon. Now, it's very important, and I bring this in my chapter very clearly, that these two thinkers have different aims, right? So their division of philosophy is geared towards different, I would call them, social and political aims, which is a huge part of their philosophical project. So Gramsci's reclaiming of first level philosophy is mainly driven by a kind of Marxist or socialist agenda of equal class relations. That's really his focus. While Oruka's reclaiming of sage philosophy is mainly driven by a decolonial, which I've put in quotation marks because clearly that's not the language of the times yet. Oruka is not using this term explicitly, but I do make a case in my chapter that I think he can absolutely be read as a decolonial thinker, Oruka, because he's doing precisely that, right? He's kind of reclaiming African intellectual tradition and heritage against a kind of epistemicide And that's one of the projects of the Sage philosophy for sure. But what's important is that, they do have different goals and different projects, which shouldn't be collapsed, and they shouldn't be, the differences has to be maintained as important. But what brings them together is that they're both, they're two thinkers who are looking for greater equality and inclusivity in their idea of philosophy. An idea that passes through a recognition of the cultures of subalterns as sites of and for philosophy. And that's really the point, I think. So a kind of, also not getting trapped in the academy as a privileged site for philosophical disquisition or philosophical debate, but always going back to that first level, the source of ideas. Now, yes, here I make a claim in my chapter that they can be seen also as precursors or as, part of the dialogue of both decoloniality and world philosophies, which are more recent. I also discuss at length in the chapter, the risks, right, to avoid also a glorification of this first order philosophy, which both of them are extremely careful of, and they never kind of fall into this risk, and the risks precisely of ethnophilosophy or populism, or what Huntanji termed third world folklorism, which is also just calling anything philosophy, right? Which is not, again, to quote Huntanji, this would not be a democratizing of philosophy, but it would end up trivializing it, which is not the point. The point is to make philosophy a tool for social emancipation, so a critical tool, not just, calling anything, which is mostly done, and both thinkers are critical of this, also at a political level. So the point is, again, first level philosophy is hard work, and we get this in both Gramsci and Oruka. There's a kind of isolation also of the philosopher who breaks away from that cultural philosophy to do their own critique of their own culture, right? Which may result in the philosopher also sometimes becoming isolated from their own culture, or, thinking differently. The point is, though, I think what is a wonderful legacy that these thinkers have left us, this, idea that this first and second level philosophy have to be in constant conversation. They kind of check one another, right? Second level philosophy without that first level kind of spontaneous philosophy, as Gramsci calls it, it risks becoming extremely sterile, extremely detached by what matters to the people, and ultimately irrelevant. At the same time, first level philosophy needs second level philosophy to be critical, coherent, daring also, and not conservative, right? Not to just be like what's socially acceptable. And I argue that both thinkers, the where and how this happens is precisely in what I have defined in this chapter, philosophical field work. So the field is where these two levels meet somehow. And we have some powerful examples of scholars who have pursued this in various ways. Kai Kresse, who is here, he, with his Philosophizing in Mombasa book, he kind of started this tradition, but all my colleagues present here and all the contributors of this book, that's precisely kind of the approach to philosophy, interviews, ethnography, a critical use of ethnography that takes stock of all the, also the negative aspect that anthropology has had as a discipline in the past, but so I would say a critical anthropology, which also Oruka contributed to greatly in providing us with new tools. So yes, I would say now this is the content of the chapter, is this comparative reading. I'm now using this as a kind of methodological basis for future research. So I'm actually presently researching in the sphere of politics and digitality. So I'm using the categories from Oruka and Gramsci, especially Oruka's notion of sage, to frame questions around digital sages. So I would like to take his work in kind of the digital sphere now, and especially understand these two levels, the first and second level, applied to the digital sphere, to see if they translate or what new challenges may be raised that also force us to push, the perspectives on Oruka even further, to go even beyond. Do these categories translate, or do they force us to also think up of new ones? And how do we keep the dialogue with, these philosophers also of the past and the categories they've handed down to us? Yes, thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you so much. We are going to come back with questions that might come up during the discussion. Reginald, do you hear me?
Yes, Fazil, can you hear me?
Good to have you here. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. That's me, but most of the time I will turn off that video camera because of some technical challenges. Nice to be here. Great, big thanks to Fazil. He really maintains the cause. He keeps this Actuvirtual Symposium going. And thank you so much, Fazil. And thank you, Kai and Oriare, for your leadership in this volume, in the production of this volume.
Thank you.
So my chapter, if you can still hear me, can you?
We cannot see
Yes.
you any
Yes, we
longer.
hear you.
We can
Yeah,
hear
you
you.
can hear me, but you will need
Yeah,
to
we
not
hear
see
you.
me. Yeah, great. So my chapter is entitled Reviving the African Sage Philosophy Project, Continuities and Discontinuities in the Research Methodology. And in this chapter, I seek to accomplish three related tasks. First, I undertake a critical examination of the evolution of Odera Oruka's conception of an African sage. Of course, the word sage literally means somebody wise. Second, in the light of the advent of globalization, I present a portrait of a 21st century African sage, specifically a 21st century Luo sage. And third, I propose several considerations in the design of a model for undertaking research on African sage philosophy in the 21st century. So under the first topic, the evolution of the African sage, I highlight three phases of Oruka's conception of the African sage. First, as a person who is rooted in tradition and who is not polluted by Western culture. And that was his 1974 conception. But in due course, he moved on from what I call a reactive to a proactive conception. This first conception was reactive in the sense that he was trying to prove to the West that Africans can philosophize. But in the second phase, the proactive phase, he is now saying one does not need to lack literacy to be a sage. One can be a sage even when one has literacy and has been exposed to Western culture. In fact, he claimed that a sage could even be a person holding a PhD degree. Now, and then the third phase is what I now call his cosmopolitan conception of the African sage, where he sees the sage as a person who is rooted in his or her culture, second, aware of the current affairs in his or her society, and third, also acquainted with the issues that are pertinent in the global community. My second topic then is the portrait of a 21st century Luo sage, where I point out that the sage of our day is markedly different from the sage whom Oruka and his colleagues interviewed and interacted with in the 1970s. Because on top of the fact that, or over and above the Arab and Western slave trade, colonialism and neocolonialism, now the sage has been greatly influenced by the forces of globalization, not least the information age and the internet, firstly through the computer and lately through the smartphone, liberalism spreading, multi-party politics, and so on. And therefore, I single out 3 features of the 21st century Luo sage. The Luo are Oruka's people and my people as well, and Yarwat's people as well. And I say that there are 3 features that are distinct about the sage of our time. One, having been an adolescent in the 1950s or 1960s, and therefore having been brought up by parents who are themselves raised up in a social milieu that was considerably much closer to the pre-colonial Luo cultural heritage, he or she is likely to have a communalistic intellectual orientation. He or she is not likely to subscribe to Western liberalism with its thoroughgoing individualism. Second, while he or she is likely to acknowledge the need to preserve traditional Luo culture, the massive penetration of Western culture has made him or her much less aware of the details of pre-colonial Luo culture than did the sages of the 1970s and 1980s. So he or she is attracted and, in fact, subscribes to the idea that we should preserve and utilize our culture, but he or she knows very little of it, the pre-colonial version at least. And third, his or her mode of communication is now much closer to that of the professional philosopher, interviewer than was the case with the sages that Oruka and his colleagues interviewed in the 1970s and 1980s. What this means, you have the sage, and the sage is usually interviewed by the professional philosopher. And the assumption is that their worlds are markedly different. But it turns out that in our day, their worlds are not markedly different because they are influenced, both of them, by Western culture and by the forces of globalization. And this has the benefit of making it much easier for the interviewer to stimulate the dialogue into pursuing a philosophical issue to greater depth than it was with earlier sages. Communication is easy. However, in light of the information age in which the sage now lives, it has the disadvantage of making it more difficult to ascertain originality, the originality of his or her thought, and thereby to distinguish the folk sage from the philosophic one. The folk sage was said to know his or her culture, but not to be very critical. The philosophic sage, according to Oruka, was grounded in their culture and were also critical and didactic. Now that distinction becomes harder in our time. In the last 3 minutes, I'd just like to share the elements of a research method for the revived African Sage Philosophy project. And that is the third main section of my article, where I point out that in the light of that portrait of the sage of the 21st century and the forces that have influenced them, there are at least 5 elements that I consider to be central to the research method of a revived Sage Philosophy project, namely the centrality of reflection. That is important. Going out and interviewing people and coming and saying they said this and that and saying I've done my research is totally valueless from a philosophical point of view, unless it is used as raw material for reflection. Reflection, engagement, assessment, analysis, synthesis must be illustrated must be demonstrated, or else there will be no distinction between sage philosophy and ethnology. The second element is the crucial place of indigenous African languages. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Kwasi Wiredu, and others have pointed out that language is the key carrier of culture. So as long as we philosophize in foreign languages without any reference to our languages, then we are not going to go very far. The third is the cautious use of interdisciplinary research. In these days, everybody seems to say, oh, my research is interdisciplinary, but we need to know what exactly is each discipline contributing to an interdisciplinary research project, or else we just talk in vague, we utter vague statements and ambiguous statements. Let us know what the anthropologist is contributing. Let us know what the philosopher is contributing, the historian, and then we'll have a really meaningful interdisciplinary research project. The next element is the need to refine Oruka's approach to empirical inquiry. In other words, Oruka's interviews were not, in some ways, had the shortcoming of not utilizing in great detail the insights we have from the social sciences about how interviewing can be made more useful. Sampling, structuring the questions, and so on. These are important. And also going beyond interviews to interaction, because Oruka's approach seemed to be highly logocentric based on the words of the sage and not going deeper into the context. I'm sure he did some contextualization, but what we are saying is we need to improve. And finally, the need to refrain from subjecting sage philosophy to insularity, where we say, hey, this is our turf, we don't want input from others. And I just want to end by saying that Oruka was a philosopher, not the leader of a cult. And therefore, the best way to honor him is to actually interrogate what he did and to work to make it even better. Because as I've been saying in my work, I say that he is not the leader of a pseudo-religious cult, but rather a trailblazer of an important trend in contemporary African philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reginald. Bruce, do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Go ahead, please.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks to my other contributors who have gone already. I think, what I want to do is, in a certain sense, springboard off of what has already been said. I come here with two roles, I suppose, one as a contributor to this volume and the other as the general editor of the series at Lexington Books, along with Uchenna Okeja, that published this book. And so to the second one, I want to say to anyone out there who has a manuscript or a project in African philosophy that they might be interested in, we would be open to talking with you. So now to the chapter that I contributed. It started really with a very kind of simple question, and I'm often responsive to these questions that I think of them as the that's weird question, okay? And so things aren't adding up, right? Things are not exactly the way you would expect them to be. And specifically in this case, it is this book that's already been mentioned, the book of Odera Ruka on Ogenga Odinga, which was his last published work. He had other manuscripts that were posthumous, but this is the last major project that he did. And the thing that didn't add up for me was that, on the one hand, Oruka is extremely clear right from the beginning. He devotes a long chapter to it that what he's going to do here is sage philosophy. And he works that out in some detail. And on the other hand, this does not look like any sage philosophy he's ever done before. I mean, it's very, very different. And those two things didn't really add up to me. And so what I wanted to do was kind of unpack what was going on here. And the short answer to what I think is going on is an evolution in Oruka's thought, or rather in his method. The larger thing that's going on here is, I think, a challenge to how we think of philosophy itself, but I'll get to that in a moment. So what was going on here was that Oruka was working with somebody who he knew well. He'd known for years, a very important figure in Kenyan politics and in Kenyan history, a friend of his father's. And so the interviews he conducts with them were done in two groups, one in the early 80s, one in the early 90s. And these interviews at places look like his interviews with other sages, where he asks fairly direct, pretty abstract questions. What is truth? What is good? What is, these sorts of questions. But it quickly deviates from that. And what we get instead is a questioning that is much more about the kind of ins and outs of politics, the backroom kind of stories, who Odinga knew, what Odinga's thoughts on things were. In other words, it looks very different. And so this might just seem like an incidental sort of thing, but if you think about it for a second, Oruka, for the entire, and I think Odur outlined this very nicely, especially at the beginning of the Sage Philosophy Project, it was a kind of answer to Huntanji's challenge, which was, what does it mean to have philosophy in Africa? Well, for Huntanji's answer is, it needs to be grounded in a literature. And that literature does not really exist yet. It needs to be a scientific literature in the broad sense of scientific. Oruka wanted to answer that back, right? He wanted to say there is philosophy. It is not just ethno-philosophy. In other words, not just uncritical, commonly held beliefs of people. It has a critical edge to it, and it is located in traditional Africa. In other words, that literature that you want is a very different literature than what you imagine. And so early on, you can see Oruka's Sage Philosophy Project as answering back to Huntanji in that way. Yes, there is philosophy here, and that desire you have for literature is I think you got wrong what that literature has to be. It can be an oral literature. It can be a culturally held literature, as long as there's a critical side to it. And so early on, as Reginald said, there is this distinction between folk and philosophical sages. And what we see with Odinga is a figure that doesn't easily fit into either of those categories. There is a critical edge, but there's a kind of practicality to what Odinga is interested in. He's interested in the kind of classic statesman kinds of questions. How do you accomplish change? How do you react to the situation on the ground? And Oruka is willing to go with him to try and understand those kinds of questions. And that's what takes him away, I think, from the method that he had established for a long time. And so what we get in this volume is what I've come to term a different kind of sagacity, which is pragmatic. I'm calling it pragmatic sagacity. And what I mean by that is a move away from the attempt to represent traditional thought, and a move towards using philosophical thought to engage lived experience, to be embodied in the world, as it were. And so there's a kind of limited kind of goal that I have with this chapter, which is to establish for Oruka that there is an evolution in his thought that maybe is, we don't easily see because it came right at the end of his life. As Kai already mentioned, this is the sort of thing that he was hoping to do more of. And Gail mentioned that as well from an interview that she had with him. But there is a larger set of questions at stake, it seems to me, which is, how do we do philosophy at all? Often African philosophy has been seen as derivative of philosophical work elsewhere in the world. It's been seen as tagging along behind. And I want to make the argument that that is a mistaken way to think about it. In other words, we can see it as trailblazing. We can see it as considering questions that are not easily considered in a more established, even ossified Western tradition sometimes. This is one of those places where that can happen, I think. And so what Oruka is doing here is to start asking the question, what does philosophy look like if we're not simply going to make it into a set of abstract principles, propositions, which then we are asked to enact in the world? In other words, what if there's a direct relationship between thought and living in the world? And so I think that's what's going on with Aruka. I think he opens the door but doesn't always walk through it. Sometimes he opens the door for Odinga to think about how one might connect thought and action in a direct fashion. But his training is so strongly in representational thinking that he always wants to go back and frame a set of propositions, a set of concepts that we can give, we might call them alethic concepts. In other words, concepts you can say true or false to. So I found this intriguing enough that I revisited this in a recent book that I did called African Philosophy and an Activist Cognition. And I have a chapter on exactly the same work of Aruka's with Odinga there. And there I try and take the angle of working out what it would look like to actually, engage philosophically as an act as an action rather than as simply a kind of something where we stand back from the world. So all of that to say, I think Aruka is doing something quite radical here. Whether he realizes it or not, he is engaging Odinga where he lives. Odinga is not a trained philosopher, nor is he is certainly a sage. I think there's no question about that. But his sagacity shows itself not by a kind of abstract knowledge of traditional culture, but as a grounded knowledge of how to work within the spaces that he was working in. And I think that is philosophically an interesting and important space as well. And so that's why I think Aruka has much to, there's much more we can do with Aruka going forward. I think that's why I like the title of this book, Rethinking Sage Philosophy. And I like what Reginald said, that he is not a guru or a cult leader, but he's a philosopher that contributed a trailblazing, approach. I think that's absolutely right. And to honor him is to walk that path that he set out for us. So I think the contributors to this book have tried to do that, and I'm really happy to be part of it. So I'm going to finish up before my 15 minutes, and I'm going to hand it back for discussion or questions.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I would like to invite everyone who is present online and in the room to share your thoughts with us in form of questions or comments. So you can, those online, you can just indicate somehow, either type your question or inform me by raising your virtual hand so I can see you. Okay. Yeah. We have.
I don't have a virtual hand. Can I speak? May I?
Yes, Donna, please go ahead.
I just want to call attention to half a sentence that Bruce said. He said that there has to be a literature. It doesn't matter what kind of literature, whether it's written or oral. And I was about to say, or visual, and he didn't say that. He kept going. Thanks, Bruce. You get my point, because my article in the book is about, my chapter in the book is about the visual codification of Maasai belief in color code. And I was just in a meeting last week at the National Museum in which I had to explain to people that once we learn to read, once we learn our ABCs and get through standard 3 or whatever, 3rd grade, if it's America, we become slaves to the alphabet. And so many of us fail to look for or recognize or understand non-alphabetic, non-literate, I don't want to say non-literate, non-alphabetic literature. And that's what Maasai beadwork is about. So that's what so I'm not correcting you. I'm just saying, hey, wait a minute. Okay, thank you.
I completely agree with that addition.
Good.
Thank you, Donna. We have also a question here from Yuki.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity to ask questions. You will notice very shortly that I'm very new into philosophy, and I have a kind of a weird background into it because, I mean, you can see that I'm Chinese, but I didn't study Chinese philosophy like systematically. I only recently I came into philosophy and I was reading a little bit of the Western philosophy, and I was asking almost the same question: what exactly is philosophy, and what is actually, to be more precise, what is a philosopher? And my question is related to this distinction. I mean, the first order, the second order, or the folk versus scholarly philosophy. I'm just wondering, how is that different from philosophy as way of life? That's specifically for the folk philosophy, and the more academic side is also it's about critical thinking, and then how is that different from meta philosophy? And also, I mean, I hear the criticism of the more discourse related, the more kind of theory related philosophy, which has been a challenge. But then there's also a very big movement towards applied philosophy. So like how do all those terms that could have some similarities, and how do you guys see the differences between them? And I have a side kind of question. How is the sage being conceptualized? I hear the discussions, and I'm wondering specifically, is sage only applicable in the African tradition? I mean, thinking of Chinese tradition, I mean, we also have all those ancient whatever philosophers. So can sage also apply to them, or sage in this sense will be more about contemporary but the kind of public intellectual? And if that's the case, then again, is there any difference between just intellectual or the philosophers? Thanks.
I can.
Right now we don't have anyone else. So I also wait. There is a question from Elvis Cosmos. I think you have read it. What is the role contribution of a sage philosopher in contemporary society? There is another one from Maria Rosa Rotner. Could you elaborate more on what pragmatic sagacity looks like, different from the learning from the pragmatic practices of everyday life? So I think, all of you can take a limited amount of time to engage these questions. And I want to add to these questions, and actually just following the sage, and since I've only read the introduction. And this comes up also in the introduction, and obviously Oruka has also engaged it. So what is it that doesn't make Socrates a sage? Socrates not as the institution as we know it, as the institution of philosophy, but as a character in Plato's scenes. And this also comes as a question to the editors, because they say they don't agree with Ibanga's idea that of what is called conversationalist, that which is the foundation of the Symposium that we read in Plato's. So how is a conversation or a discussion approach or a dialogue approach to say society, as sage philosophy separates sage philosophy from philosophy? To put it within a parenthesis, is it possible to isolate sage philosophy, to understand it in isolation, and always against Western philosophy? Is it possible, in other words, to isolate Western philosophy? So each one of you can take some time. I see Reginald, so we can start with Reginald and then continue.
Yeah. Bruce, you can go after Reginald, because I saw you were just about ready to speak, and then I'll with it.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, all I wanted to say is the question on whether the sages are only in Africa, not at all. Oruka himself was strong in stating that there are sages in every society. And in a book that a number of us edited in 2018, that came out around 2018. It's called Odera Uruka in the 21st Century. There is actually a chapter which compares Chinese sages with African sages by someone, James, I've forgotten his second name, but that book is so readily available because it was eventually made open access. So you can get a copy of that and you will see what is discussed about sages and the fact that they are not, it's not something that is limited to African societies. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, Kai, you hear me?
Yes, we just said Bruce wanted to go first. We already established that. So Bruce, you can go and then I go, or whoever else wants to go then.
Sure, I'll just respond to the very first question that was asked about the nature of philosophy itself, and maybe kind of bring in some of the question in the chat as well. So it's important, I think, to realize that philosophy is not, in a certain sense, a transcendental category, but bears the marks of its own history. And especially in the West, I think what we think of as philosophy in the West bears the marks of the rise of disciplinarity over the last couple of hundred years. Philosophy trying to distinguish itself, distinguish its tasks from things that previously were perhaps seen as part of philosophy. In the West, at the beginning of the modern era, it's no accident that that knowledge was divided into natural philosophy and moral philosophy. And much of what we think of now as the university has fragmented from all of that. And so philosophers have been faced with the question of what is it that philosophers do? And so I think part of the answer to that has focused on the focus on representation in the form of propositions, and decisions on whether they are true or not. And I think that's a restricted view of what philosophy is and can be. And I think it becomes even more obviously restricted when we look at philosophy in the rest of the world. I think we can make a distinction between the kind of reflexive learning that anyone does in a culture that enables them to cope within that culture, and the philosophical ability to reflect on that, to produce more systematic knowledge, to produce knowledge that enables us to move forward in a way that's more than just reactive. And so I think that's what Uruka was trying to do. It's not just, cultures, the notion that cultures are stable because they have been able to survive challenges, and therefore they have a kind of built-up body of wisdom. For Uruka, there has to be something more than that. And part of that is a kind of critical capacity. What I want to add in the pragmatic stage, I think, is that critical capacity does not have to become abstract, but can be embedded within a lived and embodied world. And I think within cognitive science, we're seeing more and more this notion that our thought is in our bodies, not simply in our brains. And so that move of philosophy from being only in our brains to being how we live in the world, I think is a more current one that we can already see happening in African philosophy.
Thanks. Yeah. Benedetta, then you go next.
Thank you for your questions. So I'm just thinking out loud with you here, but I think you raised a very important question about the sage and the intellectual. And I think these would have to be compared more carefully, more maybe systematically. I'm also very interested in this because, again, intellectual is a very Gramscian category. Maybe as a first response, I would say the intellectual is a political category already, right? Gramsci tells us the intellectual has a social function. I would say maybe the sage, not so directly. It can be political. Of course, the sage can also be a political figure. It can have a huge impact on politics. But I would say as a thinker, the sage inhabits another space than the intellectual. And also in the sense, it's also the one who shakes up things again all the time, even for intellectuals, because even intellectuals get sedimented in the kind of political view. The sage always forces you to rethink and re-question. So in that, I would say it's even a freer and even more critical category than the intellectual. But this is a very unreasoned, just free chatting. But I think you raised a very, very important question, yes, that deserves careful study somehow. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just chip in briefly on this question or on this last point, the sage and intellectual there. And I'd like to point to, one could also use the term local intellectual, and that's quite interesting. Also, there's this, some of you might know of this series from the journal Africa that Karen Barber is sort of editing. There's once in a while, once yearly, a special issue on local intellectuals in Africa from the journal Africa, journal of the African International Institute. And so I think there's quite an affinity or sort of, perhaps a kind of comparability of those kind of types or people who feature there. So it's, might be a sort of a fruitful investigation to tease out the kind of tension of more between those two. And a couple of other points, this the what is philosophy question, I think is really important one, as Bruce said, and also one where Ruka has something original to offer. And as Masolo wrote in his commentary chapter 1997 on him, this is also about decentering the academy or going beyond an academic understanding of philosophy, right? Where we go into there. And I think that again makes us perhaps also rethink an academic understanding of philosophy or a too scholarly, too scholastic one, rather think about the sort of the life world or the way that philosophical engagement and critique by individual thinkers is embedded, right, in quite rich life worlds. And there, Ruka himself, when I interviewed him, had a very interesting take on the need for academic philosophy to become more sagacious, as he called it. So and there he referred to basically a kind of an obligation that he assumed for sages, right, or for wise people within their societies to have, or for wise and critical thinkers, so that they should, they should be able and willing to give some guidance. So, and that's a pointer also to an ethical commitment for those who are knowledgeable in society. And this pushing for, as he called it, right, this sort of making philosophy more sagacious, I think that's a really, that was a point that was very, from my understanding, really quite dear to him, and also one that we should not, that we should also keep on our radar, keep in view. Maybe those are the points. The conversationalism, I think there, I think our point there was mostly that, also on the one hand, to say that for Ruka, the dialogical element was very important, and also the kind of the Socratic reference point, yes. But in order to, from his perspective, to sort of qualify someone as a philosophical change, there was more on that. Sort of the important thing there was for him the paradigm of this, the individual critical thinker in his social context. And maybe the final point, the possibility to isolate sage philosophy. There, I don't quite understand the question, but I would directly say no. I mean, I wouldn't see how to isolate it, but perhaps I don't quite understand where you're sort of going with that. Maybe others have more to say to.
Oriara, do you want to?
Or would you like to follow up, Fazil? I mean, maybe you can say a bit more on this. What's this interest in isolating it?
Well, it seems, as I need to repeat from reading the introduction and also listening to the presentations, that it follows the understanding of a particularity of a community. So there is a particular community that is anchored in itself, and there is an indigenous knowledge, and that can be studied in isolation, independent of histories, independent of political violence or imperialism beyond the 19th centuries, or interactions between communities. In other words, what we know from the studies of, the traveling of knowledge in our time, in our recent time, from Baghdad to Timbuktu to Spain, this traveling of knowledge beyond the understanding of that actually problematizes the understanding of any community, any nation, any attempt at nationalization of knowledge. In other words, as we know, can language be owned? Can culture be owned? Can knowledge be owned? And as we know, quoting here from Abu Rayhan al-Biruni's History of India, of how in every culture, within every nation, the other is always created as a threat. So the idea of difference with otherness and not without otherness. And here in reading this and listening, it seems that we are applying by this understanding of difference with otherness. So sage philosophy. Socrates, reading, this is of course open to reading, and I'm here just connecting with the idea of deconstruction that seems to be absolutely missing in this context. So we are happy to engage in, for example, the idea of oral philosophy and written philosophy. Then comes the question, is philosophy only philosophy when it is written down? Is it possible to separate the speech from writing? And this kind of thinking applies also to my question of, can we isolate and understand a particular community? And I must say that I also read your quotation and your insistence on Oroka's understanding of the impossibility of an authentic African philosophy as different from Western philosophy. I hope that is somehow.
Yeah. I don't. Can I say a couple of things and then you, Bruce, and yeah.
Yep.
So, first of all, also to reiterate that the book, or out here, the different takes by different authors on Oroka are that come from quite different individual also perspectives. But I would definitely say that obviously we don't get away from a historical contextual from the historical context and a changing character of knowledge, but I do think that Oroka, and also in different in the way that he sometimes approaches these sages, or in the way that he asks them questions, does take them as representatives of kind of a cultural knowledge. So we do get that impression, I think, from this, particularly from the Sage Philosophy book, and some examples there. But yeah, so that's and there we might also discuss whether this is really the most fruitful kind of entry point, or are these the most kind of fruitful questions to ask. And personally, I would say they're not necessarily, but this also goes together with his approach and the intended working on the distinction between those that he calls folk sages, who are then seen as representatives of a certain, if you want to call it cultural knowledge, that basically as archives, repositories for the important knowledge that holds culture and society together, and then the philosophical sages who are also critics, who are more flexible and so. But in itself, this, as many commentators have also shown, this supposedly clear-cut distinction is quite problematic and has a number of issues. So my own take on it, on the approach, has been that it's fruitful actually to look, if we want to document philosophical thinking with embedded in society, that it's good to be, in a way, zooming in on examples of reflection as it is expressed, sort of so reflection on the foundations of our thinking, knowing, and doing, which I think is quite a good shorthand description of what philosophical thinking is about. But how is that also expressed in genres that are endogenous to the communities concerned, right? So in particular forms of oral poetry, for example, or others, so that we don't, so that we get an impression about what philosophical discourse is through a kind of listening into what is going on in society, and not necessarily a formal confrontation of someone with questions that may come from outside or far away. So let me just stop here with these comments and pass over to Bruce to add. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Fazil, the depiction you just gave was a very nice kind of capsule summary of the limitations of what I call representational thought. In other words, what happens if our project is to try and represent the thought of a people? Well, that can easily turn into something like nationalist philosophy, or it can easily turn into some other form of ownership. Then we have the questions of, well, who gets to speak, who is allowed to speak, who is authorized to speak, all of those sorts of questions. And so that's why I've tried to move away from the entire project of representationalism and philosophy towards a project of what I think of as creation. And that shift means a shift away from propositions towards questions. And this is, I think, a real contribution of Aruka's, right? In fact, I think it's a contribution he didn't realize the potency of even while he was engaging in it. If we shift towards the idea of the question as being the central piece of philosophy and propositions as only being way markers, points on the way to a better question, then we're forced to ask, how does a community question itself in order to move forward, in order to do something new, in order to reimagine itself in a new way, in order to create something new? I mean, those versed in European philosophy might recognize, undertones of Heidegger here. There is a certain sense that we are always in a conversation in order to create something new, not simply to represent what we already were. That's a limiting project. And so I think what I want to see in Aruka, what I think is actually there, is that ability, that move towards engaging sages in order to ask, who are we as a project of creation of the future, not simply as a representation of the deep history of the past.
Mm-hmm.
Oriana, do you want to also come in here?
Well, yeah, I think Kai, Bruce have captured this, but maybe we need not to understand society and culture in a restrictive manner, because as Aruka looks at different roles and functions of such philosophy, Aruka had already conceived, which apparently was never realized, that such philosophy could even be used to create national cultures. That if we can understand the very basic fundamental principle of cultures, we can have intercultural dialogue even within a country and create a national culture. So it is not looking at such philosophy, as Bruce says, in terms of representing our culture, but Aruka was seeing that as a very dynamic way of thinking. A rational person who will always be guided by certain normative principles, because Aruka was more interested also in making philosophy practical, and that is why he's insisting a sage must be grounded in his society. And this does not mean that society is a narrow set. A sage must be somebody who is also interested in the practical affairs of society, of the world. And Kai has put that very well. Making philosophy sagacious is not this abstraction. So making philosophy practical was very important in addressing even emerging practical issues, global issues needed some philosophical thinking. And that is partly why they felt that ethnophilosophy was more like static and fossilized thought system, which was ill-prepared to address the dynamics and the emerging problems of society. I don't know whether that adds something else. Fasil.
if you want, just coming back to people online, if you want to share your thoughts with us, just please let me know somehow. Yeah.
I just want to add, I completely agree with the importance of asking questions. But the other observations I have, actually before that, I think that's also actually practically what Socrates has been using. I mean, that's his way of teaching. And that is what, during that time, one of the most important ways to really push for philosophy as a way of life, because you are forced to think, you are forced to reform. But my question is, my observation and question is then, I mean, now when we talk about 21st century, I mean, we talk about critical thinking, creative thinking, everyone is coming to this almost recognition of the importance of metacognition, asking questions. Then my question coming back to philosophy is that in this day and age, when this is almost like not universally recognized, but when it's really increasingly recognized, then again, how is the philosophical kind of asking question different from all the other kinds of emphasis on reflections, on meta thinking, on metacognition? So how is, I probably shouldn't push for that to like have to have a clear boundary, because I can't stop it. And I really want to hear some thoughts from you guys, because I mean, yeah, I'm not a philosopher or not as yet. So I really would like to hear you guys if you have more insight into this. Thanks.
Ambala, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for this very, very exciting talk. I've got a couple of questions. The first, I suppose, will be directed to Oriare Nyarwath. And the second, which is more of a comment, or rather just a curious observation to Benedetta. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not in the field. I'm not well accustomed to, you know, the seminal thinking there. But I was my interest was piqued when Oriare Nyarwath mentioned women philosophers, women sage philosophers, and that they express their philosophy in unconventional or unusual ways. And perhaps this is just me paraphrasing. And the reason why this excited me is because I prescribe a lot of work, you know, by Odera Oruka, Menkiti, Wiredu Mbiti, and other philosophers, my students. And what I realize is that a lot of these are elderly men, elderly African men. And so when you mention women philosophers, that was quite exciting to me. And of course, I'll read the book just to gain some insight in that. But could you give me a sense of some of the seminal, you know, women quote to my students, considering that I come from a totally different field. The second question for Benedetta is almost out of curiosity, presented today. I think in a long time, it's the first time I've seen the name Henry being used in reference. Yes? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you now. You done?
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry.
It is interrupting.
It's the first time I've had. Sorry?
It is interrupting.
You are cutting. We are not getting you consistently. You are a bit off and on.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it must be my internet.
Go on.
Can you hear me
we got
now?
most of what you were saying, so maybe just finish it.
It's the first time I've had the name Henry being used in reference to Odera Oruka. So my question is, Odera Oruka seemed to deliberately sort of, in a way, you know, initial that age. And for me, it's almost a deliberate act of decolonial action against the name. I was just curious, is there a reason why you use the name Henry, or is my reading a misreading of what Todero Ruka was trying to do when he sort of initialed or abbreviated the Henry in his name? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambala. Donna, do you hear me?
Yes, yes, I do. Do I speak now, or we're waiting for somebody to answer
Please go
Ambala's?
ahead.
Okay. Somebody, I think it was Ambala, was looking for the African, the female sage philosophers in Africa. If you look at my article in the book, you will see that the female sage philosophers are sitting under the tree in the afternoon in a space that is reserved for females because we pollute everything. And it's called Ankitagata. And those ladies are sitting there expressing the rules, the blueprints, and the variations on the blueprint in the color codes and motifs of glass beadwork. There they are. Have a look and think about that, because they're all around all of us everywhere, but we're never given credit very much. Are you? Yes.
We hear you still, Donna, if you... Okay.
No,
Reginald...
I muted and I was finished.
Okay, thank you. Reginald, do you hear me?
Yes. The whole issue of the distinction between the kind of reflection done in philosophy and elsewhere, that question is actually a very important question, but the answer to it really goes back to the history of Western philosophy, where increasingly the academy was divided up. This is history, this is philosophy. And it starts off, of course, with if you go back to the ancient Greek philosophy, where learning was simply learning, and then fragmentation began, and we had all manner, we had fragmentation, I think, increasing partly because of specialization. So that, for example, now you hear somebody who takes a degree in natural philosophy at Oxford is actually studying physics or something else. Yeah. So basically, that distinction that you asked, our colleague asked for between what philosophers do and other reflection that other people do, there is really no such distinction. The important thing is that the philosopher makes it their task to focus on that very act and to take it as far as it can take them. I think that is what I would say.
Okay, if Benedetta, Bruce, Kai, and Nuriara, if you can engage with the latest questions or comments, because our time is about to end. Any of you?
I can start. So thanks for your question. I honestly used it not thinking. I mean, just respectfully using the full names. I wasn't aware that there was an intention, and maybe my colleagues, Oriade, Reginald, are more, they can give a better answer to that. There was an intention to drop the Henry. No, I didn't think about it.
Yeah, he preferred to make it an H rather than to call it in full, because I think a number of us are stuck with these names partly because of our professional identity. And so some do make them into initials, and it is nice to keep them as initials when they do. Yeah.
Yeah, Kai, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I want to Reginald. Now, actually, the contribution here, I really think, yeah, Donna's piece is really well worth reading in response to the question that Ambala was asking, but also Gail's here, and we're lucky, sort of Gail's chapter, basically differentiating or reflecting on sort of 3 different female sages whom she had spoken to and interviewed in the late 1990s when she was doing fieldwork there. And what I can also point to is that we're lucky to basically have 2 of those, or 2 excerpts of those interviews also as an appendix to this volume. And yeah, and so you can see for yourself how there's particular, well, whether female perspectives and of individual perspectives based or grounded in particular experiences in different in the Luo and the Maasai contexts. One interesting aspect is the sort of the way in which sort of the constellation of being 2 wives together is sort of commented upon by one of those wives who is there presented as a female sage. So yeah, I'd invite you to the volume, and hopefully there's something there.
Oh, Bruce, you can talk first.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. Sorry, I didn't want to butt in. You know, I guess one thing that I would say maybe a larger point in all of this is, and I mentioned earlier that sometimes African philosophy has been seen as derivative or trailing behind European philosophy. And I think we need to be well aware of the ways in which it is in fact leading Western thought, or potentially leading Western thought. And I think this is maybe one of them. I mean, you know, if you look at the history in Western thought of the engagement of women's writings, it came originally probably through, letters and things of that nature. In other words, not papers published in philosophy journals, but people start to realize, because of the feminist movement, that there are philosophical reflections in these places. And then they start looking back and realize, well, there are people who were engaging Descartes, and there are people who are engaging all sorts of other people. And so now there is a space where we can see thought being worked out. Well, this is another space, right? I mean, this is another space that I think really has not yet been adequately recognized within the Western canon. And I think, it's one of those examples of where I think if we truly engage African thought, we can see that, there is something that could lead here, not just simply something that could follow.
Yes, I can make a few comments about, I think trying to distinguish philosophical critical reflection and other reflections, I think there is an aspect of philosophy which we need to always remember. That philosophy is essentially still concerned with the search and articulation of ideals and values by which human beings should live, and by which we should organize our society. That is something that is still more to philosophy and not other disciplines. So in trying to look at the role of philosophy in society, that is still a role which is exclusive, almost exclusive to philosophy. We still need to think of what kind of values by which human beings should govern their lives and human societies should be governed. So that is some special role of philosophy, and it should take that role seriously. Then, yes, the politics of naming, Ambala, you realize I use Riarenyarwat, but if you are born in Africa, the time I was born and before, we must have been given some European names or Western names or so-called Christian names or Muslim names. But there's a time when some of us who know the politics of names try to abandon those other names we don't want. So I dropped mine long time ago. But if you go look at all my certificates from primary school, you might discover that there's another name that I don't use. So if anybody is to look at my CV or my certificates, one can inadvertently refer to the name that I dropped. And I believe this is what happens to Oruka. In his only publication, he uses H of Dero Oruka. But some of us know that H represents Henry, and we may not be sensitive to the politics of that name. The same with Viredu dropped his. Ontonji, I think, may have not dropped much. VY Mudimbe dropped his. Ngugi dropped his. Masol essentially dropped his. Last week, somebody insisted that I must know what Masolo's name is because some editor insisted. I said, look, I don't want to get into quarrels. So we may have used inadvertently, but I don't think Oruka was not very insistent that we don't call him Henry. Some people he respected called him Henry. In the religious circles, they would call him Henry, but in his publications, he would use H. So I don't think he would have really been so much offended. Although I think he wished he never used it. Thank you.
Donna, you have raised your hand.
Yeah, I just want to point out that in the entire Pedo family, I am the only person that calls Odoj. Everybody else calls him John, including his late mother. So it's a period in time when Africans accepted to be named like Wazungu, and then everybody threw it off. So there you are.
Kai and Oriana, just to come back to the book and perhaps end with it. Let us assume that sage philosophy is anchored in a particular community. What does this rethinking, as the title of the book, what does this rethinking, this coming together, different philosophers or scholars from different universities do to sage philosophy and perhaps to philosophy at large?
I mean, let me just pick up on one example that comes to mind, and I don't know whether it resonates perfectly with your question, but the idea here, we've had these intense debates on the meaning of Ubuntu, for instance, in the South African context, and the cognate term of Utu in Swahili is something that I've worked on through the lens of a particular poet on the Swahili coast and his take. Now, this is something I find really fascinating and also very worthwhile to kind of zoom in on key concepts, right, that guide our thinking and that are without question accepted by the native speakers or by the community to be relevant as such guiding concepts. And then, but then look at the particular interpretations or also the diverse, right? Once we have once we understand the common connotations and notions of these, then to go a step further and look at the particular critical interpretations that people raise, that people emphasize, that people maybe are in discussion and contestation vis-a-vis each other. I think these kinds of philosophical discussions and the back and forth and attention to the particular reasoning that is then brought on board, with references and examples to the respective life worlds. I think this is completely fascinating, right? And I would like to listen into that, and I would like to be able to help facilitate access to others, right, by means of translation, by means of myself sort of helping to document maybe such kind of discussions, or by inviting sort of thinkers who we know in our respective fields. So I think this is to me pointing to a very rich kind of field, that we don't take initial contributions as representatives for a community, but rather that we look at the multiplicity of engaged thinkers who have something to offer there, and that we listen to those discussions with a fine ear to the different connotations and differences in meaning that matter, and see how they matter then for the kind of guidance that people offer through those terms.
Oriana, before we go to the other contributors, if you could just say something in that regard.
Yes, so as Kai put it, if you look at the papers in that book, you'd see in each paper, almost each paper, there is an attempt to reinterpret, to give an understanding of such philosophy. And you will see applications, comparison, like Benedetta is making a comparison. And you see at that time, one may have not, at the time of Ruka, one may have not thought of such a comparison. But you can see when you study such philosophy, when you read it, you realize it might motivate you to connect it with other forms of philosophy or systems. And the disciplines are also applied philosophy, of such philosophy. So we had in mind these reinterpretations, possible interpretations, possible applications, and various uses that different disciplines and different thinkers, scholars might find for such philosophy.
Bruce?
Yeah, I just want to make I guess, a disciplinary question as an answer to that, and following up on what Kai said. You know, it is not as easy as it might seem to work at the edges of disciplines. Reginald said earlier that everyone claims that they're interdisciplinary, but what does that really mean? The edges of philosophy and anthropology are a particularly fraught area, partly because of the history of those two disciplines with each other. I mean, there, I think, are very few people that really do it successfully. Kai is one of the best I know at that, frankly. But I think sage philosophy, in the way that it's being rethought here, is a very interesting example of what happens at the edges of philosophy and anthropology, where you are not subordinating one to the other. Right, because that's the tendency, right? To say, well, it's just knowledge systems, and therefore it's all anthropology, or it's all really philosophy, and this is just the anthropology is just the vehicle to get the philosophy out. What does it mean to actually to have those two disciplines engage as equals? And I think sage philosophy is the potentiality of that really interesting project. So I think that's why it's worth doing.
So Benedetta and Reginald, if you could.
Well, just maybe some general comments on a lot of the questions that were raised. Well, I think partly also to your question, Fazil, different times frame different answers and outlooks, right? So I think at the time Aruka was writing this book, there was really still this decolonial agenda which was so prominent. So I think also the need to frame a tradition also as different, as unique, also as opposed to the West, was very much a political necessity, one that I think we have to respect, because that was also the dynamic, which the question is what are the struggles today and how they have to be framed. So, for example, what you were saying now about looking more for, communicating geographies of thought, and, bringing these thoughts together. But that's also because probably we have to also rethink, a different kind of philosophy for the times, right? Which doesn't mean that decolonial thought is over, not at all. In fact, it's still sadly very relevant. But also that perhaps, there's different challenges, right? So, and I think that's also a very important question, how to reposition sage philosophy on a global scale, right? So to use it as a method also for kind of global challenges. Yes, and I think that's precisely the also going beyond that we try to do with the book. Yes, that's my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Dana, you can just share your thoughts very briefly before we end with Reginald.
Very briefly, I consider anthropology and philosophy and a lot of other disciplines as subsets of the study of design. Anthropology, if we think about it, I'm an anthropologist, there are others here. Think of anthropology as the study of design. Think of philosophy as an exercise in design, and it makes things a little bit easier. Of course, I'm biased because we are both designers here and we both teach design, but it's worth just check it out, just try it, to consider whatever your discipline is as a design or the study of some kind of design. It makes things a little bit easier. I have enough said, no more from me.
Right. Can I go on?
Please.
Yeah. For me, I think we are living in amazing times. After that, specialization and turfs that were created with European modernity, where people said, I'm a philosopher, I'm an anthropologist, I'm this. Then we came back now to this interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary era, but also polluted by neoliberalism and the competition for funding. Then it becomes very tempting for disciplines to put each other down. But what is important, I think, is for every discipline to rediscover its identity, but also to acknowledge its need to collaborate with other disciplines. And Odera Oruka was good at this to a level because, for example, when he was discussing political philosophy, he acknowledged the need for political science as well. So what I am saying in short is with globalization, sage philosophy, as I've said in my chapter, faces unprecedented challenges in some ways, because in order to have an area of study, it must be distinguishable from others while showing connections. And that is the struggle going on now. And neoliberalism is making it harder because of the money thing that has become such a big thing in academia now, and competition for money, while people are not very honest that that's what it is about. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reginald. I just want to thank you all for making time to be with us today. And I want to thank Kai, Uriara, Bruce, Benedetta, and Reginald also for making time. And I also want to share with you that the question I raised is exemplified by all of you coming together and working together. And that is our hope for a new way of understanding and pursuing learning and knowledge. I want to thank you all, and I will share the recording with all of you later on, and the other people who will also want to have the recording. So